In this video, we're going to take a look at adding the functionality that allows us to create authors, search authors, and view authors inside of our application. Let's get started now. To get started with creating the authors index, new, and create page, we're going to create a route for our authors. This is just going to be our author controller. We're going to call it authors.js. Inside of this authors.js, we're going to do very similar things to what we did in index.js. We're going to get our router from Express, and then we're going to set up our routes for our router. This first route here is going to be for getting all of our authors, so we'll just call it our all authors route. Then we're going to be creating a route that is going to be for creating a new author, so we'll say new author route, and this is going to look very similar. We'll say author.get, and instead of getting this a single slash, we're going to want to get /new, and this is going to be the new root for our authors. It's again going to take the same exact parameters, get a function inside of here, and we're going to want to render the new page for our authors. So we'll say authors/new, and this is going to be the new page we'll create for our authors. And up here, we're going to want to render authors index instead of rendering the index file for our entire application. We want to render the one for our authors specifically. And lastly, we're going to want to create a route that actually creates the authors for us, because this new author route is just for displaying the form, and this next route is for actually creating the author. So this is going to be a post route, because if you remember from REST, we want to use post for creation. And then our route is just going to be the same as our index route here. Instead, we're going to be posting instead of getting. And this is just like I mentioned with REST before, we're going to be posting to that collection to create a new author. And we'll call this the create author route. Just comment it so that we know what's going on with all these different routes. And this is going to take a function very similarly to our other ones, but instead of rendering something, we're actually going to do creation inside of here. So we're just going to do a simple send for now. We'll just send some data to the server or to the client saying create, so that we know that this is our creation route, because we're not actually going to be rendering, we're going to be creating. Now that we have our routes set up, let's actually create the views for our routes. Go inside of our views folder here. We want to create a new folder called authors, and this will be where all of our authors routes are. And then we'll create a new file called index.ejs, and we'll create another new file called new.ejs. And the reason we don't need a file for create is because, as I mentioned earlier, create actually just creates something. It doesn't actually render anything for us. And the reason we're nesting this inside of an authors folder is because each one of our routes should be inside of their own folder, except for the index route is kind of special because it doesn't ever go inside of a folder. So when we later create a books route, we'll have a books folder in our views, which will contain the views for that route. And this is how MVC works. Your routes or controllers will have a single file, and in the views, you'll usually have a single folder for all the files for that single root controller. For now, inside of these files, we're just going to put some text. This will say new author, and in our index, we're just going to want to put all authors. And this is just so we know which pages we're actually rendering. Then in our server.js file, we want to do something very similar to what we did for the index. So we're going to create a new router. This time it's going to be our author router, and it's going to come from that authors file that we created just a little bit ago. And then we want to actually use that router. And down here, instead of using it on our root route, we want to use it on authors. So essentially what this says is that every route inside of our author router, which is going to be the second parameter here, it's going to be prepended with authors. So if we go and look at this authors.js, you see that this first route we have is just a slash. So this means that our route is going to look something like this, authors/, and that's going to correspond with this route right here. The next route that we have is our new route, and that is going to be just authors/new. Essentially everything in there is going to be prepended with authors, and then it's going to be whatever we wrote here. An easy way to see that is to actually just start up our server. So let's run npm run dev start. That'll start up our server. And this right now is our index page from our previous video. To go to our authors page, we just type in /authors, and this is going to give us the index page from our authors. As you can see, it says all authors. And if we wanted the new page, we would just put new at the end here, and we get our new author page. As you can see, it's quite difficult to navigate between our pages since we need to manually know the URL of each page that we want to go to. So let's create a header for our application that we can include in our layouts page that'll have all of the links for all of the places in our application we want to go to. In our views file here, we'll create a new folder, and we'll call this partials, because this is where we're going to put all of our template files that aren't actually related to roots. They're just partials that we include into our other files. And in here, we're going to create a file called header.egs. And the reason to use these partials is because it allows you to break out your EJS files into smaller files, which is really important, and it allows you to import these files multiple times in other files so you don't have to duplicate your code all over the place. So inside of this header, it's going to be very simple. We're going to want to have a header, and inside of this header, we're going to put all of our different links for our application. If we look over here, we actually have the finished version of our application open. Zoom this back out, and you can see that our links are going to be our header link for our main page. We'll have a link for books, which we're not going to be doing in this episode, but we do have authors and add author, which we're going to add in. So the first thing we want to do is we want to add a link for library. So we'll do this inside of our nav, since this is going to be the navigation for our application. And then we're going to first create an anchor tag, which an href, which is going to go just to our main page, because we want this link to link to our main page. And we're going to give it the text of library. And then we're going to want to create an unordered list for the rest of our links. And inside of each one of these, we'll have an li, which will have an anchor tag inside of it. And this first one we're going to have for our authors page right here. So it's going to lead to /authors. And we'll put the text in here of authors, close off that anchor tag. And we also want to close off the li that it's surrounded in. We'll copy that down one more time because we're going to have our add author route as well, which is going to be authors /new. And then finally, we can close off this UL. And if we save that, go back to our application here, zoom it back in, all we need to do is go into our layout file and actually include this partial for our header inside of here. And we can do that very similarly to how we include our body. We need to use the exact same syntax. So we'll use this less than sign with the % and then the hyphen, and we're going to type include. And inside of here, we're going to put the actual file we want to include. And we want to include a file inside of our partials folder. And since these routes are all relative, right now we're in this layouts folder, so we have to use 2 dots to go back out into our views folder, then inside of our partials folder, and then we want header.egs. So we'll say /header.egs, and that's going to render our header at the top of our page. We can get rid of all this placeholder before and after stuff, and if we save that, refresh our page over here, you'll see that we get our library link, our authors link, and our add author link. And if we click on these, you see we go to our index page, our all authors page, and our new author page. So we no longer need to memorize the URLs, we can just click the links to be able to go to our different pages. Now it's great that we're able to go between these different routes, but we don't actually have anything that we can do at these different routes because we don't have an author model yet. To create a model, we just need to go to our models folder, create a new file, we'll call it author.js. Usually this is just going to be a singular form of our route. Our route is authors, so our model will be author. And then we want to use Mongoose, which is the library we use to connect to MongoDB. So we'll say const mongoose, and we'll require that mongoose library into our application here. So we can start using mongoose. And all we want to do is create what's called a schema. In MongoDB or NoSQL libraries, a schema is essentially the same thing as a table in a normal SQL database. So we'll create a schema for our authors, call it an author schema. And this is going to be equal to a new mongoose.schema. And in here is where we're going to define the different columns of our schema. And in this case, they're just going to be essentially JSON objects. And for an author, all we have is one singular column of a name for our author. And this column is going to have a type. So it's going to be a type of string. And then we want to say that it is required. So we'll say required true. There's a ton of different configuration you can add into these different objects, but for the most part, type and required are going to be the most common things that you're going to be using when you set up a schema. And that's all we need to do to set up our schema for our author. Next, we could just export this schema. So we'll say module.exports. We want to set it equal to a new model. So we'll say mongoose.model. We want to give a name to our model. In our case, it's going to be called author. This will be essentially the name of our table inside of our database. And then we pass it the schema, which defines that table, which in our case is our author schema. Now we can import this model in the rest of our application and use it to create new authors in our application. Now that we have this author schema defined, let's go back into our routes and actually use this author schema. So inside of our new author route, we can just pass it here some variables, and these variables are going to be sent to our EJS file. In our case, we want to pass it an author variable, and we'll set this equal to new author, but we need to import that author first to use it. So we'll import author, and we'll set it equal to requiring, and we just want to require the file that's inside of that model. So we'll go back to that models folder, and we'll get author here. This is going to give us an access to that author model that we created, and we can create a new author here. This doesn't actually save anything to the database, but it does create an author which we can use to save and delete, update things inside of the database, and it also just gives us an object that we can use in our EJS file. Now let's hop into our new page here, which is where we can create our new author and actually create a form for creating our author. The first thing we want to do is give this page a header. In our case, we'll make it an H2 that says new author. And then we want to create a form. And this form is going to be where we put all the fields for our author, as well as the submit button. And this form is going to take an action. The action is the URL that the form goes to. As you remember, inside of our authors route file, we created this route here, which is just going to be authors with nothing else after it. So if we say we want to go to /authors as our route to create, and we want the method to be equal to post. And the reason we're using post here is because in our route, we set this to be a post route. So we need to send a post request to the server. And you can only do that using forms. Then inside of this form is where we're going to put all of our different inputs. For now, I'll just leave this blank. And then we want to create our actual section for our buttons. So we'll create a button down here for canceling our form. Because as you can see over here, if I click on the new author, zoom this out, you can see that we have a name field, and then we have a cancel button and a create button. So this cancel button is just going to go back to our list view of our authors, and it's going to say cancel. And the reason we're using an anchor tag here instead of a button is because anchor tags are used to link things and buttons are used to interact with forms or other objects. So for submitting our form, we're going to use an actual button, and we need to make sure we set the type equal to submit so that the page knows that this is the button that actually submits the form that it's inside of. And then inside of here, we'll just put the text create, and we'll close off that button. And if we save that and go over here, you can see, if we zoom this back in, go to the add author page, we now have our title of new author, a cancel button, and a create button. This cancel button sends us back to the all authors page, and if we click create, you see that it sends us to that create route, which we created right here, and we just sent the text create to the server. So now we actually need to create an object inside of this author route, and to do that, we need to set up our different form inputs inside of our form here. But instead of creating our form inputs directly in the form here by putting input and etc., we actually want to create a new partial file to do that, because these form inputs are going to be shared between both our new file and our edit file for when we actually edit the authors. So instead of duplicating this in two different sections, we'll create a single file that has those form inputs in it. To do this, we'll create a new file inside our authors folder, and we're going to call it _formfields.egs. And the reason I'm using an underscore here is so that we know that this is a partial file and not an actual file that's being rendered from the server. It's just a naming convention, you don't need to follow it, but it makes it easier to figure out which files are from your server and which ones are just partials. And all we need to do in here, we want to put a label, which is going to say name inside of it. This is going to be the name label, and we're also going to want to create an input, which is going to be a type of text, and we want to give this input a name. The name is how our server actually gets the data from the object. So when this form sends information to our server, whatever this name is, in our case this is going to just say name, this is going to be what the input will be under. So when we get it back from our server, we'll be able to call body.name, and that'll be the value of this input on our server. If we change this to be name2, we would need to say body.name2 here, for example. So in our case, we're just going to call this name. And inside of here, we're going to actually put the current author's name, because if this is coming from the edit page, the author is already going to have a name. So to use that author variable that we sent down to our server from this page, remember we created this new author, and we want to use that inside of here. So we use a less than sign, a %, and then an equal sign. The equal sign essentially tells the server to create whatever text you got from inside of this function right here, so in between these two less than and greater than signs, output that as HTML to the page. So we'll say author.name, and this is going to output our author's name right here instead of this text of author name. Then we just want to close that input just like this, and if we save that, and inside of our new here, we want to just import that using that same import syntax that we used before. So we say include, pass it the path, which is just going to be underscore form fields. And now if we save that and go back to our author's new page, you see that we now get our name field here, and it looks like I have an extra parenthesis that shouldn't be there. Let's get rid of that. And this actually should be our value of our field. So we just say value equals, and inside here, we have our value. And that's all we need to do for our new form. Now, if we go in here, type in a name and hit create, that name is going to be sent to our create author route. But by default, Express has no easy way to access those variables, as I mentioned earlier. So we're going to install a library called body parser. If we just quit out of our server, run npm i body-parser, this is going to install the body parser library, which is going to make it incredibly easy to access the different input elements from our actual server. So now that we have that imported, let's configure it in our server. We first want to require it, so we'll say const body parser is equal to require, if I can spell properly, body parser. And now we just want to tell Express how to use that body parser library. So down here in our app.use, we'll say app.use body parser, and we want to use the URL encoded because we're sending these values via URL to our server, and we want to set a limit here, which is going to be 10 megabytes. This is just increasing the limit size that our server can accept, and this is going to be useful when we start uploading files to our server. And then we want to say extended is going to be false, and this information can be found directly from the documentation of body parser. Now that we have that set up, let's start our server up again. So we'll say npm run dev start. And now if we go to our create page inside of our authors route, instead of sending the text create, we're going to send request.body.name. So as I mentioned, this is the body of our form that we're posting to our server, and .name is going to be that name input with the name of name. Now if we save that, go back here, and we just want to send a name here. Let's send John as our name, and you click create, you'll see that we're outputting John here, which is coming from the body of our form. And if we wanted to say Bob instead of John, click create, now we're getting Bob. So we can actually use this name to create a new author with that name and add it to our database. So in order to create a new author, we're going to do something very similar to using new author here. So we'll create a constant variable called author. We'll set it to a new author, and we're going to pass it the different parameters that we're going to use. In our case, we want to set just the name, which is coming from request.body.name. And the reason we're not just passing request.body to the new author method and we're making sure to abstract out the name is because a user could send, for example, an ID parameter to the server inside of the body, and that would reset the ID of our author, and we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we explicitly tell the server which parameters we want to accept from the client, because the client could always send us other stuff that we don't want, and we don't want that accidentally added to our author object. So now that we have our author with our new name, we can save that author. And to do that, it's incredibly easy. All we do is call the save method on the author object. And the save method just takes a function, which is a callback, that has the parameters of error and the new author that is being created. So we can just use this callback. And inside of here, we want to do one thing if we get an error, and we want to do something else if there is no error. So if there is an error, for example, we just want to render the new page again. So we'll say res.render. We want to render that authors/new page. And inside of here, we're going to pass our different parameters back to the authors page. So the first thing we're going to pass is the author that we created here, which is this author up here. So that way, if they entered in a name already, this name will be repopulated into the value so they don't need to re-enter it. And then we're also going to pass back an error message so that we can easily display a message to our users saying that something went wrong. We'll just say error creating author. And that's all we want to do if there's an error. But if there is no error, we just want to render the user back to the page with all the authors. So we'll say res.redirect, and we want to redirect to that authors page, and we want to redirect them to the authors page for this particular author, which is going to be here, new author.id, so we can get the ID of that author. And we're going to use string interpolation, so we'll just use the backticks. Currently, we don't have this new author page implemented, so I'm just going to comment this out for the time being, and I'm going to redirect us to the authors list view page right here instead. In the next video, when we do tackle the author show page, we'll uncomment this back out so that we can go to the correct page. The last thing we need to do is remove this send here since we no longer want to send that information, and our create route is actually set up already for us to use. Let's save this, go back to our author's new page, and let's enter a name for a new author. Let's say we want to enter an author of Kyle, and we click create, you see that it redirected us back to the all authors page, which means it was successful and created that author Kyle. Let's say, for example, we tried to enter an author with no name, and as you remember, we made sure the name was required. So if we click create, you'll see that it'll just re-render this page again, but we don't have our error message being displayed. So let's create a partial to render our error message. So instead of our partials folder, we'll just create a new partial for rendering our error message. We'll call it error message.ejs. We're going to render the text from that error message variable. So remember, we need to use the equal sign in order to actually render text. And we'll just render our error message here. Currently, this is very straightforward, but as we start styling our page, this is going to get a little bit more complex. Then inside of our layout, we just want to include this exactly the same as we did our header. So we'll just type in error message here. And if we save that and try to create a new author with no name and click create, you'll see we get our error here that says error creating author. One thing to note though, is the syntax by default for using Mongoose is a little bit clunky with a lot of nested callbacks and nested if-else statements. So in order to make this a little bit cleaner, we're going to use async await for all of our functions. If you don't already know what async await is, make sure you check out my async await video, which will be linked in the cards and the descriptions below. So in order to get started with creating this async function, we'll first tell this function that it is going to be asynchronous, and then we're going to rework this code right here. So let's comment this out for now and change it as we need to. The first thing we want to do is wrap our code inside of a try catch block. What a try catch block is going to do is it's going to allow us to essentially have this error statement here, this if error else do something else. This catch is going to catch any errors inside of our try here and call our catch code. So inside of our catch, we want to do what we were going to do if there's an error. So let's copy our error code in here, uncomment this so it's all back to normal. And there we go. That's our code that we want to do if we catch an error. We want to render the new page and pass it back the author and the error message. But what do we want to do in here? We want to save the author, right? So we're going to say const new author is equal to author.save. And this looks very similarly to what we have down here. We have author.save, but instead of having a callback with that new author, this is actually going to await this author. So we type await author.save, and it's going to wait for author.save to finish, and then it's going to populate this new author variable as soon as it's done saving the author. And this is because everything in Mongoose and MongoDB is done asynchronously, so we need to use await in order to wait for that asynchronous call to be completed. Then when that's done, we can just take our code from down here, which is going to happen if it was successful, and put it directly afterwards. We don't have to worry about nesting anything inside of an if statement, and we just want to comment this one out since we don't want to use it quite yet. And if we save that, remove this commented code since we no longer need it. Now this works exactly the same as our old system did, and we can test that out by first creating a new author. This one will be called John, and you see that we actually get an error, and this is because of the way we set up our error message. This is an incredibly common problem that happens when you're creating applications inside of your EJS files. You'll have variables that will sometimes be set and sometimes not set. In our case, we never set an error message variable, so our code is telling us that there is no error message variable. Right here says error message is not defined. So we only want to display this if our error message is defined. So we need to actually wrap this in an if statement. So right now, we're going to write less than with a % symbol and no equal, which means that this is actually not going to be outputted to the HTML of the client. It's just going to be run on the server. So we'll say if, we want to use the word locals.errorMessage. And this is going to check if error messages is actually set. So we'll say if it's not equal to null, which means our error messages is set, then we want to run the code inside of it. So there we go, we have our code inside of it, and then we just need to make sure we have our closing bracket at the end here to close off our if statement. And now if we save that and refresh our page, you'll see that it actually went through and worked. And we can try adding an author without a name, and you'll see that we'll get our error creating an author. Currently, it doesn't really seem like changing to be asynchronous versus not really saved us much in this route, but as we get to more complex routes, such as updating things and working on the book routes, it's going to save us a ton of extra code by having async await instead of using the default way of callbacks inside of Mongoose. Now we have our new and create routes completely finished inside of our application. The only thing we have left to do is actually display our authors on our authors index page. Also, in our other application, you'll notice that we have a search bar here for searching for all of our different authors by name, so we'll also want to implement that inside of our authors index route. First, we're just going to start by displaying all of our authors, which is incredibly easy in Mongoose. Again, we're going to do this asynchronously because it'll make our code much easier to write. Then we're going to want to wrap our code in a try-catch again so that we can catch any errors that come up with our Mongoose implementation. And we want to just get all of the authors. So we'll create a variable called authors, which is going to be all of our authors. And we're going to await a function on our author model. So our author model from Mongoose has a ton of different functionality into it. You can do everything from finding certain authors, creating new authors, updating existing authors. But for our case, all we want to use is the find method. And we're just going to pass it an empty JavaScript object, which says that we have no conditions. Inside of this object is where you would put your different where conditions for your object. But in our case, we don't want to check for anything. So we just want to get all the authors, and we just pass in an empty object here. And then this authors variable is going to have all of the different authors inside of our database. So we're going to pass that to our authors index page. Let's copy this over here, and we'll pass that in. We'll say authors is going to be equal to that authors variable. And if for some reason something goes wrong in our application, for some reason our database is not accessible, we're just going to redirect the user back to the home page. Now that's all we need to do for our authors route for now to get all of our authors. So let's actually create our index route here for viewing our different authors. Let's look at our mockup over here, zoom it out so that we can see it a little easier. We see that we have our search authors text at the top. So we're going to create an H2 here. We're going to put search authors inside of it. That way we have a nice big heading on the top of our page. And then we have our search form, which is just going to be our name field and an input after it. So we'll have a label, which is going to say name. And after that, we're going to have an input. The type is going to be equal to text. And we're going to have the name here equal to name. And we're going to want to make sure we wrap this inside of a form. And this form is going to have an action, which is going to point to the author's index page, since we want to search on the author's index page. And this time we want to use the method of get instead of post. And that's because in our authors page here, you see that this is a get route and not a post route. So we need to make sure that we get instead of post. Last thing we need to do is add in the button, which we're going to be using for submitting. So we can just say type is submit. The text inside of this is going to be search. And we can close off our button, close off our form, and that's the form section of our application done. And now all we need to do is actually display each of our authors. Let's quickly add an author in this application just so we see what we want our author to look like inside of our authors page. So in our authors page, all we're going to do is put their name, a button to view them, a button to edit them, and a button to delete them. In our case, we don't have our view, edit, or delete pages done, so all we're going to do is show the name of the author. To do this, we're just going to put a line break here so that we have a little bit of space between our form and our actual author names, and then we're going to loop through all the different authors from our page. So we're going to use these % symbols and less thans in order to run code on the server. We're going to get that authors variable, and we're going to say for each author that we have, we want to run the code inside of this function here. And we just want to output some HTML to the page. In our case, we just want to output the author's name. We're going to do that inside of a div, and we're going to output here author.name. We want to close off that div, and we need to make sure that we close off this for each loop here as well by just closing it off. Whoops, wrong order. There we go. We closed off the actual function and the method call, and that's all we need to do for displaying all of our authors. If we go back to our page here, zoom it in so that we can see it, you'll see that we get the names of the two authors that we've created, Kyle and John, being displayed in our application. The only thing left to do on this page is actually implement searching, because if we, for example, try to search for John and we search, it still returns all of our different properties, and we only want to return the ones for John. Luckily, this is incredibly easy to do in MongoDB. If we go back to our authors route here, we can create our search options. So what we want to do is we want to create a new variable, which is going to store all of our search objects. So we'll say search options, set it to an empty JavaScript object, and then we're going to search for all of the different request parameters that we sent and add them to our search options. And then finally, instead of passing an empty object here, we're going to pass search options. So in our case, the only field we have is this name field. So we're going to check to see if we passed a name field. And we're going to say request.query instead of request.body, because a GET request sends information through the query string. As you can see, this name parameter is up here in our query string, and a POST request actually sends it through the body. So since we have a GET here, we need to use request.query in order to access our parameters. So we can check if the name is not equal to null, and we want to make sure that the name is not blank. So we'll check that the query.name is not equal to an empty string. And this is essentially just allowing us to make sure that we actually have a name passed to the server. And if we do have a name for the server being passed to it, we want to add that to our search options. So we'll say search options.name, and we actually want to set this to a new regular expression. Now, if you're not familiar with regular expressions, that's okay. Essentially what a regular expression lets us do is search for just part of the text inside of our field in the simplest case. So if we sent JO instead of the full word John, we would still get John back. So we'll create a new regular expression, which is just going to be a regexp. And in here, we're going to put our request.query.name, and we're going to pass it the I flag, which says that it's going to be case insensitive. So if we cast in capital J-O or lowercase J-O, it'll still get back John. Then that's all we need to do in order to actually search our authors. But one last thing we want to do is send back the request to the user so that it'll repopulate these fields for them. So we're going to send that back as search options, and we're just going to send back the query to the user. Let's format this so it's slightly easier to understand what's going on. And now, inside of our index.ejs file, we just want to come in here, do the same trick that we did on the new page. So we're going to set the value equal to that search options.name field that we're passing down to the server. Now if we save that, search for YL, this should get us back just Kyle. You click search, you see that it's getting us back just Kyle, and it's saving that name field inside of here for us. And if we search for JO, we'll get back John, for example. And one last thing to check is that if we send absolutely nothing and click search, you see that we get back everything, which is exactly what we want because it's just passing an empty string, and we're already checking to make sure if it's an empty string, we don't actually filter by it. Now that we have all of the code for adding our authors and viewing our authors complete, let's actually add this to our Git. So let's close out of here. We'll say git add, so we add all of our different changes. We want to commit our changes. We'll just give it a message here of initial author routes. And we can push that to our GitHub server. And there we go, it's pushed to our server. And now let's deploy that to Heroku. So in order to do that, all we need to do is say git push Heroku master. And that's going to be running. And if we go over to our Heroku site, we can open up our application. And it'll take a little bit to open up just because we're on the free tier, as I've mentioned before. And as soon as that opens, you should see that we have our new pages inside of our application, and we can actually add authors. So if I want to add an author of Kyle, for example, we click create, and now that's going to add that author to our page, and it's going to connect it to our database. You will notice though that we are getting an error, and that's because if we go back to our database cluster here, and we want to whitelist our IP address. So if we click connect, we need to add a different IP address to whitelist, and we want to whitelist our Heroku IP address. In our case, we're just going to whitelist every single IP address because it's a lot easier to do for this development environment, and we don't have to really worry about security as much for this test application. So we'll just add every single IP address by using 0.0.0/0, and if we click add IP address, there we go, we're completely done with setting this up, and we can come over to our application. We want to restart all of our dynos, which essentially is going to restart our application so it'll reconnect to our MongoDB server successfully this time instead of unsuccessfully. And we can refresh our application here, and as you can see, it loaded up just fine. So let's add an author. Let's give it a name here of test, click create, and now we have a test user inside of our authors. And if we go over to our database over here, close out of all this, make it full screen so it's easier to see for you guys, and we go over into collections, it'll load up our database, and you can see that we have an author collection, and inside of here we have a single author with the name test and an automatically created ID. And that's all it takes to set up the author's index, new, and create view. In the next video, we're going to do the exact same thing with books, which is going to be quite a bit more involved, so make sure to check out that video linked over here when it comes out. Also, if you guys are enjoying these videos, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any more of them when they come out. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.